Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. It is a pleasure to welcome back to the program Jennifer Berkshire, freelance journalist, co-host of Have You Heard podcast, author of The Education Wars, A Citizen's Guide and Defense Manual, which she co-authored with Jack Schneider, who we've also had on the program a couple of times. Jennifer, welcome back.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a real honor to be back.
So, and we've talked over the years, and I think I probably first interviewed Jack during the Obama years, maybe even in the first or maybe early second term. There's been so much that's happened with education fights, public education fights, really since the Bush years, in terms of like a concerted assault that took a couple of different sort of like, I guess, a couple of different forms, I should say. And on some level, like it feels like over the past 5 years, really during the Biden administration, and maybe even prior to that, that like the Democrats have sort of like gotten out of the game, as it were, in pushing back on what's happening. It's been very, very strange. I know that's why you wrote the book, but just expand on that and give people a sense of where we're at.
Yeah, because we could identify for folks what the Republicans have been up to over the last several years, and they would recognize instantly the way that, Republicans leapt on an issue like parents' rights and how they were so convinced after Glenn Youngkin's upset win in Virginia that this was going to be their issue. This was going to be the thing that attracted suburban women back into the fold, right? People recognize that story instantly. And then you ask them, well, gee, what have the Democrats been up to? And the answer is not a whole lot. That, they got very excited during the Obama years, as you mentioned. They went all in on a particular vision of fixing schools. We were going to have a lot more charter schools. We love testing. We were going to evaluate teachers on the basis of their student test scores. And that agenda has really fallen by the wayside, partly because the Republicans have moved so far to the right now. The bipartisan consensus has really fallen apart, but also because the Democrats just don't have a lot to say. And that is actually a big part of why we wrote the book, to try to wake folks up, to say, hey, we have this thing, this public education system that is actually like a real national success story. It's amazing that we provide kids with education K through 12 that they don't have to pay for, that we tax ourselves to make sure everybody gets it. You could never set something up like that today. Why are you guys, you Democrats, having such a hard time making the case for an institution that's as important as this one?
Well, maybe we could see a shift if Kamala Harris picks someone like Bashir over Shapiro, right? Like those two people are a massive contrast in between the perspectives that you describe.
That is absolutely right. So Bashir is the governor of Kentucky, where private school vouchers are going to be on the ballot in November. Kentuckians will go to the polls to decide whether they want to change their state constitution to allow for taxpayer dollars to go to religious schools. And everywhere this gets put up for a vote, people vote against it. They hate this idea. And so you've got Bashir out there saying, like really positioning himself as a loud advocate for public schools because he recognizes that it's good politics. He recognizes that his state, which is very rural, has staunch supporters of public schools, even in its reddest counties. And then you contrast that with Governor of Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro, who's the only Democratic governor to be a voucher supporter. And honestly, to come out with a position like that right now, when we can look at these states where Republicans are enacting these sweeping school voucher programs that don't do any of the things that we've been promised over the last couple decades, that it turns out not to have anything to do with kids in quote unquote failing schools or the civil rights issue of our time. What they're doing is they're picking up the tab for parents who already send their kids to private schools, affluent parents, and they're blowing up their state budgets in the meantime. So I would be so sad to see somebody like a Shapiro picked, not just because I think that school vouchers are a terrible issue, but because they're really, they have the potential to rally folks across party lines. And how stupid of the Democrats if they were to give up on that opportunity.
All right. Before we get into that, I want to go back though first, because I want to give like a sense of like where we have been, why the Democrats have disengaged in this, and what the sort of the fundamental underlying importance of public education is. And people should remember that really, public education wasn't invented in Reconstruction, but it was really established as a federal sort of project in Reconstruction, because of the understanding that having a public education system was crucial to creating equality and to creating the sort of like the fundamental aspects of citizenship in our country. I mean, it's no coincidence that it was a Reconstruction project, and so and I know that is like sort of like what has been missing on some level from this conversation. I want to circle back that, but could you just like briefly walk us through? We had No Child Left Behind, then we had Race to the Top, which was aided and abetted by the Obama administration. This sort of like corporate education reform, not to a large extent sort of accelerated by the Gates Foundation. And then they found out that it didn't work by their own Rand Corporation report, that their whole project was a mistake. They should have listened. But we had a generation or two of teachers who were brought in, and one generation completely demoralized, it seems, and a new generation that was brought in without any sort of like foundational appreciation of what I think public education was about. Can you walk us through some of that history?
Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right. And I think it's so important for people to realize that all the policies that you just laid out very clearly there, they're all still on the books in all of these states. So you have a lot of places right now where teachers are dealing with the intense culture war stuff from the right, while at the same time, they're still under the kind of, the gun of No Child Left Behind, and then the ratcheting up of that from the Obama administration, which was basically to say, we're going to hold you, teacher, accountable for student test scores. And then, during that whole long period between George W. Bush and Obama, the way that we came to understand public schools and their function in society drastically narrowed. And so those really important words that we heard from you, Sam, things like equality and citizenship, those were never mentioned. Instead, it was all about college and career, and we were going to define school and whether it was good or not on the basis of whether or not it raised student test scores. And so you fast forward to the present, and the reason that the campaign on the right to dismantle public schools, to defund them, to move as many kids as possible into private religious schools, it has nothing to do with test scores or teacher evaluations at all. In fact, one of the truly astonishing things about these huge voucher programs that Republicans are setting up in all of these states, and we're about to reach our 12th state where one of these programs is on the books now, that these programs actually make it impossible to track the performance of students in schools. That's how we know that all the rhetoric around student achievement turned out that really wasn't what people cared about, particularly on the right. And so you see this sort of full frontal attack on public schools. And I think what Jack and I are so concerned about is that we have a very short window of time to remind people that what you were talking about, Sam, the fact that we have public education in this country in the first place because of that vision of equality, right? And it's why we're so often disappointed in schools, because we hope so fervently that they're going to make the country a more equal place. And we can talk about why that's so difficult, but having an entire party that has forgotten the role of schools in preparing kids for citizenship, forgotten that they're a pillar of our democracy. So I'm here today, and I think you are here today to try to wake them up to that reality.
Yeah, I think this is so fundamentally misunderstood, I think. And it's very much, I mean, look, this is one of the most sort of like late stage capitalist sort of, I think, phenomena that we have, which is where education is reduced to being strictly a something that you can measure in terms of return on investment in dollars, as opposed to like social cohesion, citizenship, community, all of these other things that an education was supposed to, mobility, just in terms of not just like economic mobility, but just sort of being able to meet other people and express ideas, and all of this seems to have been lost. And it's fascinating to me, the dynamic between, you have these right wingers who fundamentally despise public education because of this. I mean, it goes back. You can just see all this stuff play out in Reconstruction. They do not want, what was an underclass at that time to have the ability to sort of like say, like, wait, these are my rights. This is what I am, an equal part of society, et cetera, et cetera. You have that on the right. And then you have the sort of the neoliberal agenda, which supposedly is going to maximize this return on investment, measured by the same way that you would measure an investment if it was corporate. They go in there, and what they do is they basically till up the ground and destroy that connection, that mental connection between what public education is supposed to be. It's supposed to be to develop good citizens. That goes by the wayside. So all you have left is this like husk. And then Betsy DeVos comes in, and talk about Betsy DeVos, because you say, I think the chapter is, okay. It's not, well, I don't know exactly which chapter it was, but the idea that like, they don't have a problem with public education, but they have a problem with public schools. Like Betsy DeVos and her husband were big on this. They want that dumb money. They just want it to go different places.
Yeah, people have forgotten about Betsy DeVos because, she stepped down towards the end of Trump's term, and then we didn't hear much from her. But she is an enormous bankroller of all of the stuff that's playing out in red states right now. And so there was some terrific CNN reporting that her group has spent something like $250 billion with a B, dollars on trying to get these voucher programs through with great success. And I think the point you make is so good because, the Democrats who were very keen on something like school choice, folks like Cory Booker, for example, or even Barack Obama, they really believed that we had, that the end goal was something like public charter schools, that, we would fund them with our tax dollars, and then we would be so impressed by the fact that they were able to raise student test scores, and that would be it. And of course, that wasn't it at all. The end goal for folks like Betsy DeVos, it's not even just to move funds from public school to private religious schools. It's to completely redefine education so that it's divorced from any place at all. They use the expression unbundling all the time, the way that we're now supposed to unbundle from our cable companies and just stream stuff. And so that's the idea, that's the vision for schooling, that your parents would just buy stuff on Amazon and call it school. And think about what an alienating existence that is. Think about all of the problems we face right now that absolutely demand a collective solution. And here you are rolling through these policies that are intended to defund schools, even in rural communities where public schools, as we all know, are the central public institution.
Right. And also, I would say that that's a big motivation for the right in cutting into school lunches, cutting arts and after school programs, but also saying like, hey, you've got to pay for your lunch. And this should not be a institution for the community where kids can go and be a part of a community and learn from one another. We want to make this as threadbare as possible so that perhaps alternatives look better. I mean, this is just classic austerity politics at the end of the day.
I think that that's a key observation. And then the other thing that I would really encourage folks to do is to pay attention to how you see these policies all being enacted together. It is no coincidence at all that the same states that now have sweeping school voucher policies on the books are also rolling back protections for child workers. They're also saying that we're not going to participate in the federal school lunch program. We're not going to pay for all kids to have school lunch. And so I think the question that we have to ask is, how do the folks who are enacting these policies, how do they see the world? And I think that our sort of logical conclusion is always that, well, they're interested in making more money. Betsy DeVos and her ilk see this as an opportunity to cash in. But we argue in the book that it's actually something much more fundamental, that these folks look around and they see hierarchy and inequality as the natural state of the world. And something that works against that, like public education, fully funded schools where kids get to learn all kinds of stuff, that works against the natural state of things. And as they see it, there are just some kids who were meant to go into the bean fields or the factories or the mines. And so doesn't it just make a lot of sense then to start dismantling the institution, the main institution we have in this country that says, you kid can be whatever you want to be?
I mean, there's Paul Wolfowitz famously got in front of Congress in describing why they went after Iraq. And they said weapons of mass destruction was the thing we could all agree on. And that sort of feels like the assault on education. For Betsy DeVos, if she had the ability, just like the government will function to collect the taxes, and then we will take that money and we will fund basically, what they would call in Pakistan madrasas, religious schools. And then some of the wealthy people would also, let's talk about the voucher program, the reality of vouchers. And then we could talk about charters. But the reality of vouchers is that in every place it's been employed, and to the extent that there's been any accountability, people have found that the number of students who are actually going to secular private schools is incredibly low for the first time. In other words, they were already going. This is a subsidy to rich people to go to that private school. There has been some people who go for the first time to like religious schools, but the number of people who it's actually like supposedly what's sold on, like we're going to give real choice, that's not happening.
No, it's not happening at all. And that's, these programs make it very difficult to track where the money's going, but we do have access to that data. And in state after state, the statistics are staggering. 75%, 80%, and even states that have had voucher programs on the books for a long time, a state like Indiana or Ohio, over time, you see the percentages of kids who are, say, kids of color or low-income kids, their participation in these programs is dropping, and the folks who are more likely to participate are getting wealthier. And actually, the statistics you cited about it's not secular private schools. That there are very few secular private schools in this country. This money
and
is
you're not
going,
getting into them with the $2,000 or $5,000 that you're getting from the voucher.
It is not going to pay for Phillips Exeter Academy. Instead, the money is going to pay the tuition for private religious schools for parents who already send their kids to those schools. Why does that matter? Because the folks who are proponents of this vision understand that it is now going to be next to impossible to take that benefit away. So suddenly you have not only a lobby group, a new lobby group in these states, but they are a lobby group of affluent parents with influence. And so you look at a state like Arizona, where their voucher program is turning out to be unbelievably expensive, close to now $1 billion a year. Not only is it cutting into school funding, public school funding, but it's forcing Arizona policymakers to make cuts to other programs, like, for example, water infrastructure. Can you imagine? It's 115 degrees in Arizona on a good day, and you are now cutting investment in water infrastructure so that you can pick up the tab for parents who already sent their kids to private religious schools. It makes no sense unless you have a real kind of a grim vision where we're all sort of fighting against each other for scraps.
Let's talk about charter schools too, in terms of the way they impact. I mean, it's been some time, but certainly in the run up to 2016, I spent a lot of time interviewing people about charter schools. One of the guys who had embedded himself at one of the Success Academy from like the Manhattan Institute, I can't remember his name at the moment, but by the end of the interview, I had him, even he, who was, and we should say, you know, a charter school started off, it was an idea by the unions. His name escapes me at the moment, as a way of piloting what could be essentially laboratories where we could integrate certain teaching techniques or organizational techniques into the schools. That went by the wayside because it was hijacked. And this guy interviewed from the Manhattan Institute, by the end, was willing to admit that, like, well, they're not necessarily cherry picking the students, they're cherry picking the parents by basically creating, you know, filters, if you will. You got to be here at 9 a.m., you know, for a meeting. And that's absolutely mandatory. Well, that signifies that somebody's got, you know, either the ability to get off their work at the time, more work flexibility, more money, or more like sort of social resources where somebody can, you know, watch the kid, or they can, whatever it is, they cherry pick parents. So the data shows that, you know, some charter schools are better, some are worse than than the average. Exactly the same as public schools, essentially, except for there's also a lot of fraud that happens in charters because depending on which state, the way they set it up. But talk about how this is also sort of like a similar, sort of almost like parallel way of creating a cleave between this idea of what schools are supposed to be about, what public schools are supposed to be about, and this idea of like everybody wanting people to get a good education.
Yeah, well, so I know exactly who you're talking about. The gentleman's name is Robert Pondiscio, and he's
Yes.
actually at the American Enterprise Institute, and that he wrote a book about Success Academy, which is a very successful and very popular charter school in New York. And what's telling about that example is that gentleman is now advising the very controversial Commissioner of Education in Oklahoma, who I'm sure you're familiar with, Ryan Walters.
Oh, you gotta be kidding
He's
me.
advising him on overhauling the social studies curriculum. He was just named to a high-flying commission along with some other famous names. One of them, Dennis Prager, the founder of PragerU, and Kevin Roberts from Heritage, who is all over Project 2025. And I think in many ways that shows you what has happened to the bipartisan coalition that was so enthusiastic about charter schools. The coalition has fallen apart. And so in many ways, charter schools are now quite vulnerable because they're at the party with not a lot of obvious friends. So there's a big push on the right to have charter schools redefined as private, so that then the protections of, say, the 14th Amendment wouldn't apply to the students who attend them. And yet, you also, you continue to have a real push within a certain branch of the Democratic Party. This would be the branch where the high-flying hedge funders congregate, right? They remain very enthusiastic about charter schools, both because of their record on achievement, and I'm thinking, primarily of urban charter schools, but because charter schools remain primarily non-union. So I think actually the conversation about charter schools has changed a lot. And if I were a charter school founder or a believer in them, I would be looking around right now, wondering if it might not make sense for me to be part of this larger coalition defending public schools, because charters actually have a whole lot to lose right now.
All right. Well, so just walk us through like sort of the fundamentals that we need to begin to, like, the concepts that we need to rally around. And then let's talk about from a policy perspective, because I look out there and I see nothing in terms of like any type of pushback, both from a rhetorical standpoint or about like, and I imagine COVID is also sort of like really, really undermined this. I mean, we had all these things happen, and then COVID's outside of the 1.5 million people who, or a million plus, I should say, people who passed away, and the people who have like a long COVID, the biggest sort of, I think, like casualty was people's relationship to public schools. Coming out of it. I mean, I think it's like, it's going to grow back in some way, but it's not, I don't know if it's going to grow back with the same sort of amount of vigor. And like, where is this, what needs to happen, and where, is there any place where it's happening?
So there is actually, there is amazing organizing happening all over the country. And so that's a big part of our book, because I think what the impression that people get is that there were school closures, people got really mad, that gave rise to groups like Moms for Liberty, and here they are just doing, like, they are cleaning up. And actually that's not true at all. 3/4 of the places where Moms for Liberty and allied organizations like the 1776 PAC, 3/4 of the places where they run, they end up losing. Why is that? It's because broad coalitions of folks are coming together, not just to defend kids, but to really kind of rally their communities around the idea that public education is essential and that vulnerable students need to be protected. And so one of the reasons that I'm so passionate about this stuff is that I actually see the organizing to defend and strengthen public education as some of the most exciting pushback against authoritarianism that's happening right now. And the reason it's taken off is precisely for what you were saying, Sam, that people on the ground in states like North Carolina, for example, where you have Republicans aggressively pushing to privatize schools, they understand that the goal is to turn back the clock 50 years or more on any kind of progress, and really to roll back the entire vision of equality and civil rights protections. And so I would argue that you're missing out on some incredible organizing, and that would be a great show for you to do.
Definitely. But I guess what I miss is maybe something programmatic. I mean, the organizing feels like it's a bulwark against, I mean, Moms from Liberty, they're lunatics. But what I feel like we need too is a proactive sort of a proactive movement
Yes.
that is, the equivalent of like an Arnie Duncan, but for the good guys, for people who see the value. And like, I mean, I have always been just an ideological supporter of public schools. Like the idea of like, it wasn't necessarily an opportunity for me, particularly in New York, that my kids would go to private school. But I see the education that kids at private school get, and
I went to an all-girls school,
one
right?
to one high school students. The amount of like of academic understanding that they have higher in most private schools. I mean, without a doubt. But the experience of like being part of a community,
Yep.
Going to school with people who are so dramatically diverse from you. I mean, my daughter just happened to just coincidentally go to a public school that was probably one of the most diverse in the country in Brooklyn, statistically speaking. But it is that, to me, like the argument that should be the highest value.
Yeah.
Because first of all, even from a return on investment issue, like the reason why these schools pay off for the most part is just simply because you're hanging around with other rich people.
That's right.
And rich people, hire other rich people because that's what their community. It's not because when you were in, a junior in high school, you had your history class was more in depth. I mean, there's an opportunity for people to follow that. But that's not why you got hired at that job at Morgan Stanley or wherever it is, for that matter. And there seems to be a vacuum where we're not seeing a political leadership that is making that case. Like I haven't heard a politician articulate this stuff in ages, it feels like.
Yeah, and I think this comes back to what Emma brought up at the beginning of our conversation. Can you imagine how refreshing it would be to have a VP who really viewed that as their job? And it is, like Kamala Harris is speaking today at the American Federation of Teachers convention in Houston. And, this is actually the first time in many years, right? Like think back to the Obama years when they would show up at these conventions and they really viewed their job as throwing cold water on the audience, right? Like a little tough love, that like we're here to explain why we're going to make your life and job harder, and you have to suck it up and take it because you don't have any other choice. And so I absolutely agree with you that having somebody who has that sort of bully pulpit, who can really rally people around this bigger, broader vision of why we have public schools, it's really smart politics right now. There is a reason why in state after state, Republicans are not allowing their own citizens to vote on this stuff. They're, like in a state like Idaho, they tried to keep rural folks from testifying on a voucher bill because they knew they couldn't drive 9 hours to the state capitol in Boise. It's just smart politics to do that. And no, there really hasn't been anybody else in, say, the Biden administration who has played that role. The Secretary of Education, Miguel Cardona, sometimes he sounds like an Obama era throwback. Yep. Sometimes he's kind of inspiring, but for the most part, who really knows? So yes, I have very high hopes. And like Emma, I am waiting on the edge of my seat, just hoping that they are not dashed again.
I hate Shapiro for many reasons. I mean, he compared the student protesters on Gaza to the KKK. I just praying it's not him for many reasons. But Bashir, what's great about him, and this is kind of widening the conversation, but he can really, I think, speak to rural voters in a way that isn't condescending. And he talks about the opioid epidemic and how you can and contrast that with J.D. Vance, who makes it just kind of a personal pathology for the most part. But what's could be exciting if Bashir is the pick is Kamala Harris. My guess is she's going to run on childcare and elder care, right? And things about like increasing that for folks. And with abortion being on the front at the top of the ticket and women's reproductive care, that could really be a rounded out, holistic ticket about families, schools, how can we make your family life better by strengthening our public schools, strengthening your ability to have child care and take care of the older people in your life. And she can do that as a woman as well in a way that could be a really exciting opportunity for Democrats if they take it.
I love that idea. And to me, it's so utterly preposterous that the Republicans are now, they are the party of the working class. They are populists. And yet, they have adopted as a litmus test issue that you have to support school choice. And that if you're a rural Republican who views part of your job as standing up for your local public schools, they are going to primary you. And so we've watched this now play out in state after state, in Iowa, in Texas, and they're having great success doing this. And so that means that you now have rural Republicans who are no longer represented on this issue. And you think about it, like the public school in a rural community, it's not just the key institution, it's the largest employer.
Yep.
And so you have somebody like a J.D. Vance saying, we're the party of rural populism. And yet, one of their first big moves is to say, hey, we're going to defund the local public school. It's just such an opening for a candidate who really understands that dynamic. And like you were saying, can articulate this stuff in a way that doesn't sound phony or condescending.
What just give me your take on what's happening with Texas, because there's been a real assault or attempt, and there's been a sort of an odd coalition, if I understand what's going on there, maybe not so odd, of like who's been pushing back on these sort of voucher plans.
Yeah, so the key thing you need to know is that the governor, Greg Abbott, has made enacting a private school voucher plan really one of his top priorities. And so in order to do that, they really have to lean hard into the culture war issues. And so, he's been on the stump arguing that there's a rising wave of transgenderism that's threatening to swamp the Texas public schools. And then you have big money coming in. And so Jeff Yass, who is very chummy now with Donald Trump, people will know him as Pennsylvania's richest resident, but also an early investor in TikTok. So he has poured millions and millions of dollars into Texas in order to help Abbott try to enact school vouchers. And they did exactly what I was just describing, where they knocked out all of these rural Republicans who support their local public schools in hopes of now being able to jam this through when the legislature reconvenes. And so, yes, you have odd coalitions on both sides. But I think it's very telling that they, we're now months and months into this and they have not succeeded. And the longer this drags out and the worse the evidence is from other states, it's getting harder to hold up a program like this in a state that doesn't have one, when people can look at Arizona and be like, wow, they've blown an enormous hole in their budget.
Yep.
This does not seem like a good idea. And so on the one hand, Abbott may have the foot soldiers that he needs to do this, but they are going to have a hard time selling this.
Jennifer Berkshire, freelance journalist, co-host of the Have You Heard podcast. The book is The Education Wars, A Citizen's Guide and Defense Manual. You co-authored with Jack Schneider. Really important, I feel like, underlooked, like the ratio between how fundamental public school is to so many sort of like downstream issues, and the amount of attention it gets is way there's just too disparate of a delta there. Really appreciate you coming on. We'll put a link to that book at majority.fm.
Well, I so appreciate your having me, and the fact that both of you appreciate my passion and concern. I feel like we're a party of 3, 4, if you count my co-author, Jack Schneider.
Right. Okay. Send him my regards. Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.